Since news of COVID-19, anti-Asian animus and violence has increased dramatically in the US and North America, especially toward the poor and working class, women, migrant, queer, trans and non-binary, and elderly Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. The Atlanta spa shootings, which took place on March 16th and resulted in the deaths of 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women, emphatically underscores the necessity to attend to racialized misogyny as a key site of white supremacist violence. Today, we center the voices of Asian American women and non-binary activists, artists, and scholars, and look toward more robust modes of solidarity. It's my privilege to introduce our 5 panelists, as well as today's moderator. Hye-Yeon Chu is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Toronto. She's the author of Decentering Citizenship, Gender, Labor, and Migrant Rights in South Korea from Stanford University Press 2016. Her research on gender, intersectionality, citizenship, and urban sociology has appeared in Gender Society, Sociological Theory, Positions, Asia Critique, Urban Studies, and Sexualities. Her current book, project examines social activism in contemporary South Korea as sites of emergent critical social theory and new political imagination. She has translated Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider and Patricia Hill Collins' Black Feminist Thought into Korean. Tao Lee Goff is a writer and a DJ specializing in the narratives that emerge from the histories of race, debt, ecology, and technology. Dr. Goff is an assistant professor of literary theory and cultural history at Cornell University. Her research is rooted in decolonial thought, literature, and theories of labor that center Black feminism's engagements with indigeneity and Asian diasporic racial formations. Yves Tong Nguyen is a queer and disabled Viet cultural worker and sex worker whose organizing home is with Survived and Punished New York, Red Canary Song, and Free Them All for Public Health. Yves is here representing Red Canary Song, a grassroots collective of Asian and migrant sex workers centering base building with migrant workers through a labor rights framework and mutual aid. Red Canary Song works from the belief that full decriminalization is necessary for labor organizing and anti-trafficking. Grace Pei is the director of organizing at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Chicago, where she manages and leads strategy for issue-based campaigns and power building work. Grace has spent the last 7 years organizing in Chicago toward racial, economic, and immigrant justice, and has trained hundreds of organizers and community leaders across the country. Grace also serves as the founding executive director of Asian American Midwest Progressives, a political organization established in 2019 that endorses progressive candidates for elected office. Our 5th panelist, Racel Salazar Pareñas, teaches sociology, gender, and sexuality studies at the University of Southern California. She writes on the labor and migration of women from the Philippines. Her latest research is the forthcoming book, Unfree: Migrant Domestic Work in Arab States, from Stanford University Press. So after 5 to 7 minutes of reflection from this esteemed group, my collaborator and today's moderator, Kimberly K. Hong, who's an associate professor of sociology, a CSRPC affiliate, and director of global studies, will join and moderate the conversation. She's the author of Dealing in Desire, Asian Ascendancy, Western Decline, and the Hidden Currencies of Global Sex Work, published by the University of California Press in 2015. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists and moderator.
So should I just start? Okay. Thank you so much for bringing us all together today. And thank you so much for joining us in your very busy schedule. My name is Hye-Yeon Chu. I teach sociology at the University of Toronto. And I was born and raised in South Korea, but spent most of my adult years in the US and Canada for the past 17 years. And I'm finally realizing I am an immigrant and I am an Asian woman in this context. When I first read about the Atlanta shootings, I was in shock and also quite numb. But then it felt as though it confirmed the fear that many of us in Asian communities have experienced for more than a year now, right? And I really wish it didn't take a mass shooting for people to see the gravity of this situation. I was attacked on the bus last February, for being Chinese and bringing COVID to our country in my own neighborhood in Toronto. And that fear has stayed with me for quite some time. But while I had the choice of staying mostly inside, working from home as a professor, I mean, that's not a fair choice for Asian Canadians, but regardless, when I had the choice, many of my fellow Asians who work in essential jobs or run small businesses, they did not have that choice. And so, like the victims in Atlanta, they became the ones who bore the brunt of the anti-Asian violence and hate. So when an American news media contacted me for an interview last week, I said, okay, well, I'll do whatever I could to tell people that we care about these women and there are people who care about them. And so I said yes, which I rarely do. And so I was on the phone with a journalist and she asked me, how did the gender and economic inequality in South Korea push these women to immigrate to the US? And I mean, I am the expert in that topic, but actually I refuse to answer that question in this particular time. Because I was so tired of people treating us like we're from somewhere else, belong somewhere else, and the sources of our problems and sources of our struggle somehow belong there, not here. Like many of us here today, the 4 Korean women who lost their lives last week, they spent most of their adult lives outside of South Korea, from 1970s and 80s. And so their stories and the heartbreaking end to that story, to me, is an American story. We talk about intersectionality as a word, but to me, that question ultimately is, who claims them? Who claims these women as their own? And why isn't America claiming them? So I told the journalist that the story here is the US labor market that relegates South Korean and other immigrant women in low-wage service sector jobs. Whether they held middle-class jobs in their home countries in South Korea or not, in the US, their educational and work credentials are not recognized. Their English fluency and accents are ridiculed, and they can only find any kind of employment opportunity within the immigrant ethnic market, whether it's restaurant, cleaning, or laundromat or spas. And it's a story of gun control or the lack thereof. It's a story of dehumanizing Asian women in the context of US imperialism and militarism, whether they're working in the sex industry or not. It's of criminalizing and stigmatizing sex work and make them vulnerable to gender-based violence and workplace abuse. None of this, not surprisingly, made it to the paper. They did find somebody else to talk about how gender and economic inequality in South Korea is bad, and that's what, so there's that. But denied as fully American, these women's lives are also not fully claimed as Korean story either. And here I was quite disappointed and saddened in many ways by Korean media. While the Atlanta shooting and 4 Korean women's death have appeared in Korean media a bit, it wasn't the front page news in a way that I think it absolutely would have been if there were Korean or Korean American doctors, professors, anyone who fit the model minority myth, or even college students or tourists. So last Wednesday, we had a gathering of scholars and community members in Korean diaspora. And there I made a statement that we as members of the diaspora, we should claim and remember these women and commemorate their death as fully our own. Diaspora isn't just a space full with immigrants, but I think as a place of non-easy belonging, it is for a space for people who are in between, one that needs to be consciously created and rather than assumed. So this, I think, is a space where intersectional resistance that of race, gender, sexuality, citizenship, and class could emerge based on people's realities that are already multiracial and already intersectional. And I think this is a space that we have today, and I hope we can remember these women's death as well as their lives. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank Professor Snorton for the invitation to speak today, as well as my fellow co-panelists, and I'll just launch right in to my collected thoughts. American Alibi on Seriality and Evidence. The Atlanta air rings and stings of murders, but this is not the first time such devastation has occurred. It is the first time that authority has been forced to recognize the devastation as crucial. James Baldwin wrote these words in his book, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, in 1985. And today I'd like for us to linger with the category of the not seen in order to grieve the 8 people murdered, because they are potentially undocumented, migrant, sex worker, working class Asian women, potentially under the table for tax purposes. I ask, not seen by who? Baldwin draws his evocative title from a biblical verse by St. Paul. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, in order to frame the murder of 28 people in Atlanta, mostly children, many young Black boys, a few girls, and 2 men. Though a man sits in prison for the crime, it is still considered by many to be unsolved. This was the magnitude of death required in order for the FBI to pay attention, in order for news media to create a headline. The pattern is unmistakable. These deaths form a pattern of serial murders of people of color, the most recent deaths that occurred just weeks ago. 8 people murdered, part of a sequence. But to some, the motive is still unclear. To others, it is clear as US imperialism and the disposability of Asian life, especially of women. How long will America be innocent until proven guilty? The alibi of whiteness is the alibi of a bad day and the right to bear arms. To repeat Baldwin's words, the devastation has always been crucial. The Atlanta air continues to ring and sting of murders, of white supremacy. The haunting of the southern metropolis is felt in the way that race structures the commercial and air traffic hub of Atlanta, the occupied lands of the Muskogee and other nations of Indians. There are many racialized layers of death, and the evidence of racial violence against Asians was supposedly heretofore unseen in Atlanta. Why, I ask, do we segregate our grief? 8 people were gunned down March 16th, 2021 in massage parlors in broad daylight by a white Christian man. All deaths carry the same alibi, the American alibi of white supremacy, a bad day. For me, when I heard the news, I turned to Baldwin as a reflex. I turned to Princeton professor Ann Cheng's writing of Racial Melancholia, the difference between grief and grievance, as a reflex. My intellectual genealogy, a way of processing grief, Black and Asian thinkers who have theorized the nation's guilt and grief. As a professor myself, I connect these historical threads between African and Asian diasporas across the hemisphere in classes that I teach on Afro-Asian feminisms, solidarity, and intimacy. And it is not lost on me that it took a so-called Chinese virus for Black lives to matter. So no syllabus can save us, but in literature and history, I have found myself as an Afro-Asian woman turning to theory and to history as tools to process this. And each day I sit with the European and US colonial archives of anti-Asian violence from the 19th century, the mutilation of Asian laborers, collapsing lungs, scars, flesh, suicides, Asian laborers hanging themselves by their queues in Peru, Guyana, Jamaica, Cuba, the United States. On a daily basis, I sit with these Cantonese depositions in translation, resistance against the mutilation of the body, against torture. So in a country where the normative category of woman equals white, is there any room to grieve for the bodily harm against Asian women? The Asian woman becomes a specter that haunts the United States as a figure and a fantasy. We need only look to the Page Act of 1875 as evidence of racism and sexism, the intersection of hate imagined towards the Asian woman's body. It was determined through that legislation that the Chinese woman was lewd and immoral, and so was barred from entry to the United States because of her loose morals and sexuality. This structure of racism was extended into 1882 and what became the Chinese Exclusion Act, and really did not end until 1943, allowing quote unquote war brides against Asian women to become the linchpin, determining a kind of respectability to open the gatekeeping nation. The phantasmatic structure of race continues to haunt the category of the Asian woman, but what of the actual Asian sex worker, a public enemy unseen? The Chinese women, or women assumed to be Chinese, were presumed as prostitutes, as sex workers, as threats to the nation, but in truth, to the nation's gene pool, a threat to whiteness. So fast forward to the present moment, and I want to suggest that we are all guilty to varying degrees for a desire and obsession with evidence. What is adequate evidence for racial violence? The obsession with evidence is prurient and is much based on, say, the TV show Law and Order, SVU, a procedural belief in criminal justice, as it is inherited from the Enlightenment, the so-called Age of Reason. Transparency is a given and a virtue. Seeing is believing. Things unseen represent a threat to the American dream. This obsession with evidence is the burden of proof that is also the burden of representation for people of color. Premature death of essential workers, nurses, nail salon workers, grocers. We need to interrogate our appetites for consuming the death of cis and trans women. True crime as a genre and its resurgence today is ugly in the way that it lives in the podcast Serial, for instance, or the Netflix special, Making a Murderer. A new audience grows of conspicuous consumption of gory violence against women, a sequence of blood. The serial killer becomes the star. He controls the narrative, seriality, his psychology. The United States is a serial killer. American Psycho, a white man. True crime is his genre, and it is our guilty pleasure. What about Hae-Min Lee, the murdered Korean American Maryland teenager in Serial? The anonymous death of a Korean American woman in the South is in excess of the category of special victims. Those who choose to look away and those who refuse to understand what Celine Pareñas Shimizu calls the hypersexuality of race and its burden for Asian women are the same who fail to understand that from Black History Month to Women's History Month to anticipating Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, there is a sense of exhaustion. Some are unable to process how all of the above can be true at the same time, intersectionality. They fail to process what it means to feel it all. But I cannot, and I refuse to segregate my grief because I feel it all. And ultimately, Baldwin's title is about faith, faith in the power of what is not seen. So today, I hope we can sit with the beautiful power in the intersection of what remains unseen. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Tao. Thank you to all of the other panelists, and thank you, Professor Riley, for inviting me to be in this space with y'all. Perhaps for me, I have not been able to really be able to reflect and process my feelings in this moment. And I wanted to be honest to that in this reflection. In our vigil that we held for Red Canary Song, I quoted Benji Hart, and I partially want to quote another part from that passage now as I reflect with you. My sadness is proof of my love, and my love proves that I am driven by profound spiritual bonds to my people, past, present, and yet to come. And it is just as unsustainable for us to ignore violence, ignore the political reality of our oppression. It is equally unsustainable to pretend that it has not affected us and that it is not affecting us every day. And perhaps after what had happened in Atlanta, many people don't really know what my and other Red Canary and other Asian migrant sex worker, massage worker organizing groups had reacted to this. But when we had found the news, it wasn't something that we thought was going to be picked up and become mainstream. When we initially reacted to it, we saw the news, we felt that we wanted to say something publicly simply because we felt that the people who had died were our sisters. And then to wake up and find that the news had become very mainstream and that we had become mainstream, called upon us in ways that we had not expected, and called upon us to offer analysis, as the people on this panel have offered in their academic work and their work otherwise. And feeling like that we had to acknowledge certain realities of things that people were ignoring, right? And it's still happening now. As people talk about the issue, we see a lot of people that don't hold the intersectionality of the issue and that don't want to talk about the way that criminalization has affected these women and other people all across the country and all across the Americas. And as we were called upon in this moment, I think it's been hard to think about what this might mean. And for me, I've continuously asked myself what we might have to lose in this moment as our movement becomes much more mainstream. And as we partially see people not holding that grief and also not necessarily accepting all the parts of what this means, right? When they're not holding that intersectionality. People want to claim these women as a part of our community, but only in parts and not as the whole, and not acknowledging everything that might have gone into it and are still not necessarily talking about it. So I find it hard to reckon with all that this moment could mean for me and all that this moment could mean for us when I feel that we have a lot to lose and that the moment is still calling upon us to organize and to work on a near daily basis, as we've already seen losses here in New York, as we've already seen for calls for increased policing. And I also feel that a lot of people might miss the moment. So I feel that my reflection is incomplete, but I thank you for having me here.
I also want to echo other panelists in thanking, the center for putting this together and for all of you for participating. It's really an honor to be part of this panel with all of you. For me, I also want to kind of ground in my, I think, emotional response, which was numbness, as others have shared at first. This just real, I think, deep sense of dread and just kind of this pit in my stomach that, we as an organization and I think as a community had been bracing for something like this to happen, but for it to happen in this way and on this scale and just in such a tragic form, I think was gut-wrenching, but it was hard for me to feel that, in the immediate aftermath. For me, Asian Americans Advancing Justice has been working on legislation to require Asian American history be taught in public schools. And I had to testify before a House committee at 8:30 the next morning. So I learned at like 8:30 Tuesday night that this tragedy had happened and had to kind of like pull myself together, to speak to the importance of teaching our histories and bringing our communities into the fore and not letting our communities be invisibilized as, we have been, and as, particularly those who are most marginalized in our communities have had their identities erased, or as Eve said, only selective parts of who these women were are lifted up, in the media or in conversation or otherwise. And so I think, for me, it took a day. My partner shared that his reflection is that I was going through kind of different stages of grief, that my first reaction was numbness and then deep sorrow and just grief, where I just cried and couldn't control, my emotion. And then anger, at seeing how people were being portrayed in the media, at seeing even the quotes that media outlets pulled from their interviews with me, just the kind of very selective and narrow way I think that these stories were told. And, I see so much of my family and my loved ones in these women, in these businesses. I grew up in an Asian American community with lots of small businesses like these, massage parlors, nail salons, Korean spas that are 24 hours that my grandmother goes to every week and has gone to for decades. It just, I think, hit close to home when I finally was able to feel the emotion. But I want to echo what you've said in that, as much as I think this is an opportunity for our community broadly to really face anti-Asian racism and violence and to combat that, in a way where we can all come together to end racist violence in all its forms, no matter which communities of color are targeted. I think there is also a danger in how this moment can be used to further goals like increasing policing or increasing penalties for hate crimes that have a lot of really negative impacts on our communities and also other communities. And so as someone, working in Chicago, who's lived in Chicago for the last 11 years, I just want to share an example that has come to mind for us as an organization and for me, which is an incident from, I think, 2013 of Chicago police raiding an Asian-owned tanning salon or, some other spa business and physically assaulting and verbally assaulting the spa manager there, who was an Asian American woman, Jessica Klychek. And that when we, see responses to call for increased policing, that we have to remember that this doesn't serve our communities, that policing, has contributed to this, to these, both the sexualization of Asian women and the, different stereotypes and ways that those policies have been used to harm our communities, going all the way back to 1875 and the Page Act, as Tao mentioned. But that there is this violence, inherent in our system, and that, that this attack in Atlanta happened on the heels of the deportation of a bunch of Vietnamese American refugees, right? That we have to, I think, look at the entirety of what anti-Asian violence looks like, how it is systemically perpetuated, and use this moment, I think, to the best of our ability to really, I think, move us closer to justice and not to kind of react, in, I think, a very reactionary way, that can create and inadvertently, in some cases, perpetuate harm. So those are just some of the reflections that I've had over the last week and a half. Thank you.
So, thank you for having me here to join this, important panel talking about this very sort of very tragic issue. So, like the other panelists, when this happened, I think it took me 2 days to even function. I was really impressed with Kimberly, who was able to write an op-ed right away. I was I couldn't even think, I mean, I was just, sitting there. And I think I still haven't really completely processed, what this means. I think for everyday life, right? I mean, it's scary. But then what's been impressive about this is it's called attention to racism against Asians in a level that, I've never seen before in terms of this acknowledgement that there's violence that faces this community. And then another thing that was really stunning for me was the explosion of, writings of op-eds that have been, written on this and to educate the public, so I really commend my colleagues, and in terms of really, acting, being really proactive in responding to this, tragedy. But while I really commend them, as a feminist, I was also kind of very frustrated. I was incredibly frustrated because there was only really two narratives going on. And as people on this panel were saying, it's, not intersectional, but what does that mean, right? So, there's this one narrative coming from, both, women and men, that was really situating this tragedy in this, 150 years of anti-Asian hate crimes. And that's really, really important, right? And that it is true that this is, part of this long, legacy of, violence, against Asians, to throw them out of this country. So it's not just legal violence in terms of excluding them, but it's also physical violence that a lot of Asian workers in the early 20th century experienced. People have also tied this to military activities against Asia and the dehumanization of Asians. And that is not incorrect, right? And so, but that's one dominant narrative that this story has been put under. Then the second dominant narrative, I think, is one that I'm a little bit more upset about. And that's really sort of this dominant feminist perspective, whether you're a pro or an anti-sex work activist. And so then, what also came out, I think there was this really jarring USA News article that was basically interviewing people from Polaris, people from this anti-trafficking group in New York, Restore New York, I think, where they were basically just saying, oh, this is bound to happen because, sex work is this dangerous thing. And these were illicit massage parlors. And for me, that was really offensive because none of these women identified as sex workers, publicly. And so then for me, this was just kind of this jarring continued sexualization of Asian women that these feminists were also committing, right? And then it was normalizing the dominant view of them, the dominant racialized gendering of them as sexualized beings. And so I think we still really have this work of putting forward, a lens that's really foregrounding how this is a racialized and gendered, experience, as I think we're trying to achieve in this panel. So I do think that the cinema scholars, speaking out, giving us the history of the representation of Asian women as hypersexualized has really helped us, really in terms of foregrounding a more intersectional perspective. And so I commend my sister, Celine Shimizu, for her work on this, her pioneering work on the hypersexualization of Asian women, and how that has really concrete, material effects, endangerment of people's lives, as, we read in Elena Shee's important New York Times op-ed about, how the assumption that, masseuses are just sex workers, causes concrete damage to their lives. So then I do want to also say, so I'm trying, so this is obviously what do I do then as a scholar, right? And so then, so Gender and Society, the sociology journal, approached me about writing a commentary. So I'm writing a commentary with my former student, Maria Wong, on this, on how we can make this a more gendered, racialized perspective from the get-go. And so I think what we're trying to argue is that, what this is it exceeds just a racial subjugation. It's really a racialized gender subjugation. There is really this image of Asian women as these villainous temptresses. And this villainous temptresses makes us untrustworthy people, that we are basically this disposable bodies for white male rage. And I think that, this constitution of us as villainous temptresses is not just in cinema, but it's also in the law, and it's not just in the Page Act. Because if you actually look at one of the last laws that shaped Asian women's experiences, it's the 1986 Immigration Fraud Amendment. And so this is particularly an anti-Asian woman law that basically established that women who are marrying Americans, usually white men, are basically morally dubious. They're basically there to dupe these white guys, these innocent white guys, to use them for a green card, and then they'll divorce them soon after that. And so because of this law, since 1986, when you marry as a foreigner an American, you no longer automatically get a green card. but you actually become a 2-year conditional resident, meaning you have to be married to this person, even if they beat you up, for 2 years for you to be able to get US citizenship or residency. This law has been revisited numerous times, but they can't seem to let go. Lawmakers can't seem to let go of this like notion of the foreign bride, which is usually an Asian woman, as this morally dubious person who's there to like victimize the white dude. And so then they keep on amending it with like the Violence Against Women Act, but then they still can't let go of that conditional residency. And so it's still there, actually. And so then I think, there's these these deep-seated, gendered, racialized assumptions is in our society, and it's so ingrained in it, right? And that's why such violences can emerge, because I think that there's this deep-seated gendered racism against, Asian women as not just sexualized, but like untrustworthy women, right? Then you can just expend them. And yeah, so let me just end there and let's open it up for questions.
So thank you so much. I just wanted to thank Riley for responding to an email that I sent at 5 in the morning to organize this event. And, I want to start by saying a real heartfelt thank you to the panelists, to Heyun, Eves, Tao, Grace, and Rochelle, because, as Rochelle had said, when these events occurred in Atlanta, I was definitely frozen. I mean, I channeled it into an op-ed, but I still feel a bit at a loss of words. And there is a reason why there are 5 panelists today, and why Riley and I put our heads together and chose 5 panelists, because as many of you said today, it's such a multi-layered, complex issue that in this particular moment, so many things intersect on it that many of you touched on. And I just want to recognize and say thank you for coming today while you're also still processing, because I really empathize with the trauma of experiencing this event and then having people like us tug on you and call you and suddenly ask you to help us understand what is happening right now. And so I just want to acknowledge that and really say a heartfelt thank you, because I too am struggling with this in this moment. And so what I want to say to the audience, and there are, it looks like over 150 attendees. If now's the time when we'll take questions in the Q&A. So I just want to check to see if this will work, but I can also, if the Q&A works. And so, but I can also, what I also will do is launch into some questions at the beginning while we're kind of taking some questions from the audience. So one of the reasons why I wanted to bring us all together here and is to kind of have this conversation about intersectionality in this particular moment. So what we have is a moment around COVID-19, as Heyun said, where there has been a rise of anti-Asian violence that she has experienced personally, that many of us have seen. At the same time, that there has been this movement, as Tal said, around Black Lives Matter and anti-policing, and the ways in which the criminalization of sex work kind of looms in the background of this. And that is a bit about what Eves and Grace sort of talked about. And then sort of the last layer, I mean, not the last, but another layer that Rochelle had mentioned is the way in which myself included, is guilty of this, just sort of are trying to process these women as sex workers. That's actually a framework that this guy that placed on them that we now realize was not a correct framework, but that you have everyone from the anti-trafficking side of things to the sex worker rights activists sort of seizing this moment to make commentary about what this is. And so what does it mean to sort of untangle some of these identities and frameworks in a moment where we're also thinking about, as Grace said, these businesses as being sort of Asian immigrant businesses that are commonplace, where now there's this fear and anxiety that you're going to see sort of hyper criminalization and hyper policing on them. And so as we kind of think about these layers together and, with putting all of you together as brain trust, I would sort of like to take a moment to ask you to reflect on this, because I think, as Marcel said, and one thing I will say is, having written the op-ed, one thing that is frustrating is the way, and Hae-Yoon had mentioned this too, the way that the media controls the narrative. And the reason why I wanted to bring us together to have this conversation is so that we can kind of take control over there. And because as I was writing the op-ed, I had this back and forth with Vox about why I couldn't call this a hate crime. And I'm not the only person. The New York Times did this to someone else. The Washington Post did this to someone else. And so in some ways, while there has been a proliferation of op-eds, the media also shapes what we're able to say in those op-eds. And so, taking that media lens away from this and having an open dialogue, I would like to hear some of your reactions to these multiple layers. And, some of you touched on this, but I would like to kind of dig deeper and have a deeper discussion on these topics. So if anyone wants to just react.
If I may, this is Eve speaking. I think that when people talk about sex work in this context, right, I think that it's wrong for people to make assumptions that they were either not sex workers or that they were sex workers. Sex work, one, is also a political term, right? So the context that you use the term sex work is specific to certain people. But what we acknowledge, right, as Red Canary Song, as organizers who do this work, is that whether or not these women in Atlanta were ever engaged in sex work or self-identified under that term, they were harmed by the expansive criminalization of sex work and whorephobia that exists throughout our culture. And I think that a lot of people's pushback is kind of wrong as well, also misses the point when people try to say, oh, well, if we name it or if we attach the idea that they might be sex workers, then people seemingly think that they might be deserving of that harm. I've seen this reaction from people everywhere, but we also know that that's wrong. Even if they did engage in sex work, even if they didn't identify as sex workers, they wouldn't have deserved that violence. They never would have. And they would still be human. And also, the pushback against the idea that massage businesses are connected to sex work is obviously a part of a larger racialized and gendered stereotype and assumption that's made about these women and these businesses, and also just Asian migrant women who do low-wage labor in the first place. But the pushback that people have against it also harms people who might engage in sex work. The ways that people interact in massage businesses is really complicated. Some businesses engage in sex work, some people inside of businesses engage in sex work, and some others don't. And even if you engage in it, some people might not want to talk about it, right? There are people who work within the same massage business that might engage with sex work that are not going to talk about it with their coworkers, right? If they're offering certain services under the table or not. And this also completely neglects the reasons why people might engage in sex work to begin with, right? Why someone who is a migrant worker might engage with sex work, especially if you're undocumented. And I think that completely misses why we are talking about it, especially when you look at these larger frames with these people who are either pushing for pro-sex workers' rights or anti-sex work, right, and anti-trafficking efforts in an effort to say, oh yeah, they were engaging in sex work, or maybe they weren't engaging in sex work and they're sex trafficked, right, completely misses the point as to why we talk about it in this way, because they were criminalized. And at the very least, right, if they weren't, the person who killed them viewed them in this way, and that is rooted in the criminalization of sex work, the stigmatization of sex work. Someone wouldn't have viewed them in this way if we didn't have such rampant criminalization and stigmatization. And I also generally want to push back on the idea that connecting them to sex work might lead to some over-policing or hyper-policing, hypersexualization. That's something that they're already under. They're already over-policed on a consistent and daily basis, as any amount of policing is already over-policing. They're already criminalized to the point of danger. They're already fighting for survival every single day. And partially, I think that that's something that's being missed in the conversation when we're talking about intersectionality and being able to hold all of this, right? And of course, want to completely shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw, right? The reason we see the exact reason that Kimberly Crenshaw came to talk about this sort of intersectional framework happening in this moment, that legal frameworks, the criminal justice system, the sheriff who was giving statements, right, are not capable of holding the intersectionality of this issue and are not able to look at how this issue affects, like specifically when talking about Kimberly's work, Black women and women of color. So when we see this, right, they say, oh, it couldn't have been motivated as racially motivated because the person said it wasn't racially motivated. When was the last time you ever met a racist who was going to like openly say that they were a racist when you said that to them, right? But we know that it is racially motivated. We also know that it's entirely gendered. We also know that it's connected to the criminalization of sex work. We know that it's like connected to the criminalization of immigrants, especially those who are undocumented. It's completely connected to the hate that people have for working class peoples. It's connected to all of these things, and that so many people were incapable of holding that, especially the criminal justice system that so many people were looking towards right now.
Yeah, can I just follow up on that? I completely agree. And I think that we have to know the difference in terms of dealing with the specter. So the figure, in italics, the fantasy that these white men hold about Asian women, right? And that was as important and clear in the Page Act of 1875, not whether these women were or were not sex workers. It's actually the fantasy that we have to sit with in the figure because of the harm that that causes. So I just want to second what Eve was saying about undocumented women and even that specter in terms of who's desirable, who's considered undesirable. And also COVID, I feel like that hasn't really been talked about. And I framed this in terms of a kind of racial contagion in terms of thinking about this moment. But we need to sit with the kind of bodily nature of skin to skin contact and what it means that these were massage parlors in any case. So I feel like we sort of don't have the language if we rest on the criminal so-called justice system. In order to talk about what is the difference between a so-called hate crime, as Kimberly was raising, and like what is a crime of passion? So yeah, I'd love to hear what others think on the issue.
I think I need to push back from where this conversation is going. And so I'm someone who like writes, who's written about sex workers. So I'm definitely not against sex work. But I think I do have a problem with this incident suddenly becoming a platform to talk about sex work. I do see sex work in a larger continuum of what, you know, I sometimes prefer to call intimate labor, to basically call attention to the fact that sex work is not this exceptional type of work. You know, I put sex work in a wide gradation that can include someone working at Hooters and someone actually having, you know, sex like through intercourse. So despite my wide-reaching definition of how I perceive what a sex worker is, I think there is something about perpetuating the sexualization of Asian women and basically sort of taking in this unconscious bias of embodying what that perpetrator like saw them as and not how they saw themselves. And I think there's like a huge danger in that we are like sort of re-victimizing them in a different way. So how can we learn how to articulate their experiences, not from our political agendas, but really look at them as how they were perceived and injured? And I think that when we start insisting on and imposing the sex work narrative, it really falls under this very dangerous path that I find it's not like I don't really care about alienating X or Y. I don't really care about the police. But I think as an ethnographer, I have this deep commitment to really capturing the experiences as they perceived it, right? And I think they really perceived themselves, they probably understood themselves as sexualized beings, right? Which is very different from saying this is like a sex work issue. So how do we talk about it politically from that stance? And so I really want us to be cautious about that. And that's why I think I have a real big question mark on feminists, whether they're pro or against sex work, that have like used this as a bandwagon to make their claims and cause.
Are there other reactions? There's 5 people, so it's hard in this webinar format. I can move on to the next question too. Okay, so there are a number of questions from the audience, and I will just pull from here. Ju Yun Park. So I just wanted to ask, can we pull people from the audience to ask their own question, Tiara? Or Riley, do you know if this is possible in this format, or do I ask these questions? Okay, not in the webinar form. Okay, so here's the first one. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command has 375,000 troops and 60% of all U.S. warships deployed across the vast lands and waters between Western India and Hawaii. The racialization of the coronavirus occurred alongside a military push for even greater expansion in the Indo-Pacific and on the heels of years of escalation against U.S., quote, state enemies in the Asia-Pacific. Given the historical significance of Western invasion and occupation in making the practices of gendered and racial violence against Asian women, how can we extend our analysis in this moment to encompass U.S. imperialism and capitalism? I think this was something that some of you had touched on, but would be great if you could expand on in your comments.
I'm happy to start us off and chime in on this. You know, I think that I agree with the person who posed the question in that we can't separate or only talk about the history of anti-Asian racism or the dehumanization of Asian Americans in the United States. We have to kind of look at it from a global perspective. And I think capitalism and imperialism are deeply intertwined. I mean, in the same way that we've been talking about, the ways that these women were working during a pandemic, right? Like working low wage jobs in these like very, I think vulnerable positions, both in terms of the ways that their professions, have been criminalized or targeted, by law enforcement, but also in the ways that they were, working low wage jobs, like probably didn't have access to, really great healthcare or other important, I think, things that people need to thrive, right? Like the positions that their families might have been in. And I think, we have just kind of pulling a couple of themes from the conversation that we just had, I think we've seen so much media focus on the perpetrator of this crime and not the people who lost their lives. And I agree that I think, we just need to shift our perspective much more to center the people who died, who were murdered in this way and their families and, the wholeness of their lives. I think there is this, kind of overall, effort to kind of reduce them and their identities into like much more simplistic terms. So I think it's hard to kind of talk about this in a global context. There's so much at play, I think, with how, Asian women are treated and viewed in the US that is linked to these legacies of US imperialism, and the ways that capitalism, I think, really forces people into work that is vulnerable, like that is dangerous, that creates so much risk that people just have to live, right? That I think there's a lot of measured risk, like with these different identities that you hold, whether it's because you're undocumented or because you're a low wage worker, or because you don't have healthcare, or any number of, I think, identities that make it really complex and important for us to like bring the different nuances and the differing perspectives, around how to talk about the shooting and the harm.
Maybe I could just speak briefly about the U.S. imperialism and militarism in the context of Korea. When I saw that Young Yu's story, one of the victims who immigrated to the U.S. As a spouse of an American military, and that is a familiar story to a lot of Korean immigrants, because even in the face of even before the immigrant exclusion was lifted in 1965, the early years of Korean immigration to the US have, it was mainly through the marriage with American spouse, right? And that is the camp towns around the American military bases in South Korea where I do my research. And so the stories of the women who came with their spouses and they sponsored their families from Korea. And so a lot of the core of Korean immigrant formation in the US is tied to that history, although many Koreans, as Jiyeon Yeo's book really tellingly shows, how that story is often hidden, often stigmatized, and not talked about. But it shows these kind of unseen stories reveal itself in these kind of moments, as Tao was telling quite poignantly. And I think it is these kind of connections that we should really center and delve into the women's lives of how they came to be here and what are the kind of political contexts that their lives have been shaped by this geopolitics.
Yeah, I think I'd love to follow up on that, because I think that the point that you just made about, or in your talk, was about them having been here, some of them from the 1970s and 1980s, is really significant. If I think about my own mother migrating in 1970 and like, what would the headline read? What would it take for her to become American? And even like being Jamaican Chinese, is that even something that Asians would be able to understand, whoever is considered Asian? So I think the question does obviously extend beyond the United States, and diaspora becomes a really useful resource for us all in terms of how we're thinking through all of this. But also, again, thinking historically, because I am really based in the 19th century, there is this way in which the figure of the Chinese, again, not necessarily a Chinese person, but those who were assumed to be, were considered unassimilable, were considered that naturalization is never possible. So I just think it's important to sit with what that means and to kind of think about ourselves and how we are frustrated at the evidence that we don't have to say that the cause was US capitalism, racial capitalism, imperialism, and whether they were sex workers or not, right? We don't have this evidence. So my piece was really a way to sit with why it is that we want and demand this evidence. And I just don't think the answers are there, but we can sit in the possibility of the speculation and the speculative of the richness and fullness of what these people's lives were and what they continue to mean to their families and loved ones.
Sorry.
Oh,
go ahead.
I mean, I think as a kind of ending note around that, in what like Hyun and Tao are talking about, is that I actually see that the refusal to hold the intersectionality of this issue is a refusal to reckon with US imperialism and capitalism as it relates to the history of these women, but also to this work in general. So I see that. I think that the centering of imperialism and of racial capitalism is necessary to this conversation, and an extension of those conversations around the intersectionality of the issue.
I think for me, what was striking was the older age of the women and the fact that they were still working, and that you could see how these immigrant women were, fit this narrative of being unable to retire, that likely, wage workers, or that they were not, or that they worked in the economy, which then denied them access to a retirement, right? So these are women who, basically are so one was in their 70s. I mean, for me, that really striking was continued employment. And the interviews with their, families made it even more heartbreaking. They were like, well, they were gonna, they're from New Jersey, and then they're actually only staying in Atlanta. Their friends were there, and then they were actually, one said they didn't really have to work, but then it sounded like they had to work. The single mother, for example. But for me, I think it's like those sort of like labor insecurities, right, are being left out the narrative, and it's as important.
So there was a question in the Q&A that picks up on this conversation that you're all having right now. So I'm going to kind of go out of order because I think this question follows up with this conversation. And I'm really sorry if I pronounce your name incorrectly, but it's Megumi Rierson. So this person says, I've seen a lot of interpretations of intersectionality in the context of this tragedy to mean listening all of the victims' various identities in laundry lists as reasons we should identify, stand in solidarity, etc., with the victims and the Asian American community at large. This, to me, misses the point of intersectionality as a way of speaking about racial and gender oppression in a hyper-specific, layered way and building movements from that specificity. How do we talk about the victims and this moment in a political way, connecting it to broader history and broader organizing without flattening the richness of the lives and experiences of the individual victims? And I go to this question because it's what Hae-Yoon and others have said in terms of really naming these women and really thinking about their lived realities and what Rachel had mentioned about their age, and this question of how do we think about them as sexualized workers or as sex workers? And so since we're on that topic, I just thought I'd take this question and continue it.
Well, one thing I just want to start with is that I think one of the challenges that I have faced in kind of thinking about how we talk about these women and their lives and the communities and all of these intersections of structures, right? Systems that have impacted them and how they were able to live and be, is also trying to create space for the families to have privacy and grieve too. Right. And thinking about how can we center them and give them space to tell the stories in the ways that they want to tell them, knowing that they may not tell them in a way that we think that we all agree with or think is right. Right. I mean, I think it's really hard to hold these sometimes opposing, right, emotions or just even beliefs that my analysis around the ways that racial capitalism and, patriarchy and misogyny and immigration, all of that the ways that those systems impact their lives, may not be kind of how those families want to center and uplift their lives at this time. And, I just think it's been really hard just to think about the very real grief and loss that these 8 families have experienced, and also the need to have a conversation about the structures and the structural oppression that they all faced on these multitude of levels, right? And so it's hard for me to feel like there is, any one right answer. I feel we all on this panel bring different perspectives and different viewpoints that I feel add to the conversation in really important and nuanced ways, but that there isn't a silver bullet to figure out how do we talk about the intersections of their lives in a way that that advances, I think, some of the values that we may want to see real in the world that are not currently real in the world.
I want to add to this by sort of emphasizing, and addressing this question, why did this tragic event, spur such sort of this, intense reaction? And I think, one of the biggest reasons is because it really heightened how race is something completely ascribed to you, right? So whatever you do is just sort of racially ascribed. And so you see then all these op-eds of women talking about how they're sexualized, how, they're racialized. And I think it really just brought to the forefront this sort of shared racial ascription, an intense, violent one that was sort of normalized, right? And so then I think it became sort of regardless of, what you are or what you did, or, it was regardless of what you were doing, you were ascribed to be X, right? And that you couldn't get away from it. And I think that's what caused a lot of paralysis, a lot of fear. And I think it's it raises, these questions for us, how do we then use this as a moment, as a moment to act, as a moment to really call attention to, this very kind of like, violent shared experience that Asian women have across their differences, right? And so then for me, as I was thinking about this, what was so sad for me was, the absence of feminist sociological response to this tragedy, right? Like you were like, where were the sociological studies? Then you realize, oh my God, there's like hardly any sociological studies that can really explain this like racial ascribed gendered experience that we have, right? It was so few. And so most of the spokespersons from an academic context were like a lot of historians, sort of explain, cinematic historians or like, legal historians. But where are these sort of like everyday experiences of violences that Asian women face that we as sociologists talk about? You're like, oh, there's like not really there, So then for me, I think that's also speaks about sort of there are racial hierarchies, right? And we see that in academia of like what is meritorious to study, right? And we know Asian American studies remains like highly marginalized, right? And I hope then this sort of, calls attention to the need, like for more of these studies that really document these lives.
And I really just think that it's partly to do with what I was terming as this segregation of grief that continues to take place. So, what Eve said about the part and the whole really resonated, as well as the fact that it is so clear that everyone, it feels, is looking for a point of entry to some different part of these women's identities. And I think we need to sit with why it is that people need to feel they have a point of identification with these people who were murdered in order to care. And a problem of having to have some way in, and not just to feel grief, to kind of understand a collective grief, and to think about that across deep time, across deep space, but rather to segregate who we're going to care about, if they are related or not, or if they look like us, or if there's a way for us to identify. But what if we could just grieve and like sit with the not knowing? I think that's what I just want us to push to do in this immediate kind of wake.
I think that if people are laundry listing their identities as reasons that you should care about it, they miss the point of having an intersectional framework when talking about it in the first place. I don't actually think that you can untangle all of the parts of these women's identities. Like, that's actually why we talk about it in this way, that you can't necessarily untangle it. And in speaking as an organizer, right, like what kinds of efforts do we make that still honor these people? I think that in holding that intersectionality, in our incapability of untangling it and not knowing, right, and not looking for the documentation, is honoring their memory. And also in talking about it with specificity, because the topic requires so much specificity, I actually want to push back on a lot of what I've been seeing as a lot of like Asian women talk about how they're hypersexualized. Well, I actually think that you kind of miss it, right? When you try to hold on to this moment as a reason for you as an individual or to speak on it from that position, because these women also face very specific violence for being migrant women, for being older, for working in the massage business, right? For working in a business that is linked to sex work and being incredibly criminalized for the work and all of these things, right? So I don't actually think that this moment is a moment for all Asian people. I don't actually think this moment is a moment for like all Asian women. I think that we actually have to hold the specificity of the topic and be able to talk about it in these really specific ways and how we organize and how we move about it in order to actually honor these women's lives and mourn their deaths.
So on that note, Eves, there's a question in the audience that directly links to what you just said. And in some ways, I think you addressed the question, but I want to pull the question back up and have you expand a bit more, because I think your point is really important. It's from Jessica Zhu. So Jessica says, as an Asian woman, I feel trapped by the white man's imagination, objectifying women, hypersexual as Asian women, feeling entitled to be nurtured, cared, comforted, satisfied sexually by women. And when that entitlement is not satisfied, white men feel entitled to revenge by beating, harming, maiming, killing women. Given this reality, what are some of the effective ways to hold these men accountable? What does justice look like to you? So in some ways, what you had said about this this being a moment that not all Asian women should sort of clamor onto, some like very, very much do identify with this moment and the continuum of what it means to be an Asian American woman, an Asian American sex worker, so on. And so since that question was there and you were kind of addressing it already, I was wondering if you could expand a bit or if other people could react to that.
I definitely want to leave room for other people to react to it. But I mean, my initial reaction to this question is partially that I, of course, understand people like feeling this moment and also really identifying with these women, right? And the violence that they faced, also partially because you don't often see this conversation occurring in the mainstream, right? So I understand that. And I think that like feeling that is probably fine and is also probably a part of the process for which people are moving through this grief of seeing this very publicly, but also want to note that the ways that we talk about it is really important, which is why I think that a lot of the op-eds or like the pieces that come out that talk about the way that Asian women are hypersexualized, especially coming from like middle class, upper middle class Asian women, kind of miss the point. But in the conversation about how do we hold these men accountable and what justice looks like to me is, I think, rather complicated. I don't know that people here really know this, but I'm a prison industrial complex abolitionist. And so I think that when we talk about accountability, we have to talk about our communities. We have to talk about the relationships that we have with people, right? So if you're talking about a really specific person or a specific instance, then I think accountability is going to look really different for you than it does for everybody else, right? And the kinds of relationships you have with people. As for what justice looks like to me, I mean, to me, I certainly think that justice doesn't look like more policing. Justice doesn't look like putting people in prison. I don't think that people should like go to prison for the violence that they cause onto other people. I don't think that that is a solution. And I think that it's violence itself. And I think it's really hard for people to ask what I think would be justice in this moment, especially for these women, especially for the people who were killed in Georgia. It's really hard to ask that because I think it looks different for everyone, but I want people to ask questions as to who you're looking to for that justice and whether or not you actually think that that is going to solve the issue, right? Which is why I keep bringing up like criminalization, because a part of the violence that people are subjected to, that massage workers are subjected to, that Asian migrant women are subjected to, is this criminalization for who they are, for their survival. And if that is coming from the criminal justice system in the US, from the government, from the state, I don't think that any of those people could ever be our solution, could ever give us the justice that we need or want, as they are causing the violence, as the police and the prison system continuously are violent and are violence themselves. So even if in this exact specific case that we talk about, in this exact specific situation that occurred in Atlanta, the police were not the actors of violence, but they certainly contributed to it. So they can't be the solution.
I want to say something here because I don't want to diminish anyone's feelings of marginalization and sort of telling you that that's less than other people's marginalizations. I think that's like really dangerous to tell people, especially to our younger generation. I want to acknowledge that people's feelings of marginalization are genuine, are real. And if this tragic thing, like triggered it, then I'm like really sorry about that. And I'm sure like when you walk in the streets, you're like looking behind your back and you're more afraid, whether you're at Whole Foods, you don't know if someone's gonna like suddenly like, assault you. And so, I think, yes, there's more spaces that it's more dangerous. Yeah, to walk the street at night is more dangerous than walking in the street in the daytime. But is walking in the street in the daytime mean it's not gonna happen to you? Like, no, right? Like we know that. So I think it's really important that we don't use this moment to create hierarchies of our experience and say what's more important, like what's more just, but to like see and to recognize everyone's feelings of marginalization, like including yours.
Megumi. And so then, and so I want to like, use this, not as a, platform to say, well, these peoples are the worst and they're the only ones we're going to like call attention to, but like actually use this as a moment for like forming a coalition across our differences. And so I think it's really dangerous to put hierarchies on people's feelings of marginalization and say, people in like a capitalist state, so the working class is worse. Yeah, we could say that. But like, what is that going to accomplish? And who are we going to alienate? And so I think we have to be really careful here in the assertions that we make.
If I could just add to that question, I think that there's a lot to lose, as Eve has said, but there's also then potentially a lot to gain. And if in that question we just received, if people are prompted to now pick apart, right, Asian women, and to sit with what work is Asian as a category doing? What work is women as a category doing? Then we could get somewhere meaningful. So yeah, I just think it's interesting who feels triggered in this moment, who feels like they're being talked about when the term Asian woman is being used, but it's not them who's being referred to. So I'm noticing this especially in terms of South Asian and South Asian American women who are hearing Asian women, but they know this is not a conversation about them. Also, in terms of, I heard a news program this morning about Korean American adoptees who were sitting with the fact that they didn't know what to do with this situation. And I think that it's all a bit misguided in a sense, but we should sit with the question of why people feel left out of this kind of national moment. And it has to do with these two categories, Asian and women, that we cannot take for granted or continue to. So I would love if people would think about the difference actually, and think about the fact that there is Chinese colonialism, there's Japanese colonialism, that we need to understand these layers and to furthermore think about Southeast Asian identities across the region and centuries of what that has meant regarding China and Japan in particular. And we can also think about the specificity of Korea and those histories. So I think until we're ready to do the work to push against that, to think about who sex workers are, the fluidity of women as a category as well, then we're just going to keep having the same conversation. And I think for a lot of us who are scholars of race, it is quite cyclic. Like this feels like something from the 90s in a lot of ways.
Well, and I just want to add that, I mean, I think, I agree, I think with Russell that it's important to validate people's experiences or feelings of marginalization, but to also challenge the ways in which their experience, their lived experience is very different from, what these women experience and like what the reasons that they were targeted in the ways that they were targeted. Because I think that's an important opening for the continued politicization, or maybe the new politicization for wealthy Asian professional women. I think that is an important opportunity in this moment, people who see themselves or see their loved ones or their mothers or their sisters or their grandmothers in these women, to also realize okay, yes, I experience, I see elements of my experience in this tragedy, but then to also be pushed to interrogate the ways in which their experience is very different and what it would mean for them to really stand up for other women who are in those situations that are very, very different. Because we talk about income inequality within the Asian American community, right? It is a vast chasm, right, between rich and poor Asians. I think the widest income inequality of any racial group in America, right? Those realities, I think, are part of what is invisibilized in our public narrative, right? That there is this sort of flattening of Asian America and what the experience of Asian women, right? But it's not all the same. And I do think we can hold this opening for people to really feel and grieve, and also use it to move them to develop a much more whole understanding of, what Asian America and what the experiences of Asian women look like.
Well, thank you for all these conversations. I'm really learning a lot. And, for me, intersectionality is ultimately a critical intervention to a single access frameworks and to ask who are we relating, which group is relating to these women as their own. And to me, what's also interesting is how the death of these women didn't trigger the kinds of feminist response in a way that the London murder case did. So why aren't white women in America who are feminists see these women and call that as their own? I mean, that to me is an interesting, why are you saying to me who's sitting in Canada, I'm so sorry for your loss, when actually it is your loss. You are American. Like, I'm not American, right? So to me, that's an interesting part, who claims them and why certain elements like class that Russell was highlighting, like, why aren't we see, working class white people or even other working class people, immigrants, see these women and relate them as our own? What intersection is that they don't see it, but we as Asian women, this becomes a dominant mode of reference. So I think that's a question for us to ask.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to combine two questions from the audience that also touches on some of the themes that you all discussed today, which is about sort of the criminalization piece of this. So Yubin Kang asked this question of, how do we reorient this around away from increased police violence? And Wendy Lee similarly says that they were at a rally this weekend in Chicago where many of the attendees from the community were holding signs calling for increased law enforcement, saying phrases like "all lives matter." And then this is a third question that I'm trying to combine in the interest of time around the policing and criminalization of this so if while we might be critical of the sort of criminal justice system, Aya Tusky asks, what have been some of the most powerful actions outside of the criminal legal system that you've all seen in response? So I guess one part is a critique of the ways in which this intersects with the criminal justice system, but also, what are some productive responses that you've seen outside of that framework?
Okay, so I think that in terms of pushing back against calls for increased police presence, criminalization, calling for like using language of the state, right? Like to call it a hate crime or to call it terrorism, right? Is to get to the roots of the violence itself, right? I keep bringing this up, that criminalization is so important to the conversation, specifically around what happened in Atlanta, because it plays such a big role in how these women are perceived, in the work that they do, in like their livelihoods, right? And the violence that they were subjected to, I can imagine on a near daily basis, as many massage workers here in New York often are, right? And so we know that police cannot possibly ever be a solution to this specifically, right? I don't think that the police are a solution to any form of violence ever. But I do, just generally in talking about this specific situation and looking at it, if you get to the roots of it, know that they're not the solution. And I think that's the only way that you can talk about it. And as for the sort of interventions that we've seen outside of the police, I mean, it's hard for me to say that I've seen some like big change occur outside of the police in this exact moment. But what I do know is that massage workers, Asian migrant workers, especially those who are undocumented, sex workers, have all been doing this work outside of the police, could never have gone to the police for any form of violence that they were subjected to because they're criminalized, because they would have been arrested, because they would have been asked to like identify themselves as any number of things in order to gain access to social services. So all of that has been occurring outside of the criminal justice legal system for a long time and have always, because those people know what their realities are and who they can turn to for help, right? And that's also true of other folks, the most marginalized, the people who are the most vulnerable in our communities, right? often those who are criminalized, often those who engage in criminalized work, whether that be sex work, whether that be like drug use or anything like that, right? And so they know what those modes are and have been doing it for a really long time. And you've also seen this mobilization over the summer when we look at the movement for Black Lives, right? Like huge mobilization for mutual aid and these sorts of networks that people have been doing for a really long time because the government was never there to help certain people, right? So they've been using these sorts of modes outside of the state for a really long time. And I think that in this moment, I would ask people to pick that up and keep going with it, right? And to support the people in your community, to support those people who are criminalized, to support people who exist on the margins and were never supported by the state to begin with, right? And to expand those networks is what I think, one, I partially am seeing, but also what I continue to ask people to do.
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo what you've said. And I think, this term kind of community care is one that we've seen coming around, that's kind of what that looks like, right? These more informal networks and maybe sometimes very formalized, right? But that whether they are rooted in institutions or not, that especially, right, immigrant communities, communities of color have found ways to band together to support each other when they knew that they could not rely on other structures. So I completely agree with that. I think that there is also, an important opportunity to fight for the existing kind of social service fabric and for our government structures to better serve these communities, right? And I think, coming from an organization that does advocacy and does organizing, we all have different roles to play, right? And so when I think about, this Chinatown rally in Chicago, I mean, it's one that, we were asked to support, that we could not support because of the calls. We knew that there would be calls for increased policing, but that at the same time, we can't afford to completely alienate those people from our movement, right? The people who are feeling, I think, not radicalized, but that are feeling kind of politicized to do something around anti-Asian racism right now that maybe have not felt this way before, or have not done anything around this before, that there is an opening that somebody has to take advantage of, right? And that we need to kind of do the work to okay, meet them where they are now with a vision of where we want them to be, right? Whether that's engaging with issues of anti-Blackness within the Asian American community, whether that's classism, right, within the Asian American community, that there are lots of these issues within our community that we certainly need to tackle. And that I think this can be an opportunity to move people who are certainly not abolitionists, right, are probably the furthest thing from it. But we don't want them to I would say we have seen concerted effort of the Asian American right to organize, and they are capturing people who are upset about the things that they see happening to them in their communities, right? And so if the left, if progressives are not organizing, that we're not offering a compelling narrative for what's going on and what they can do to address it, we will lose them, I think, to, rising conservatives in the Asian American community. And so, I think, again, we all have different roles to play, and I think we all have to kind of figure out what can I add, right? How can I be moving our community, our solutions, right, in the right direction that long-term will not contribute to an increase in policing, or will not contribute to this criminal legal system, but that, still leaves room to meet people where they are at.
So I want to add to this conversation about how we should look at this. I mean, I really think obviously heightened policing is not going to do anything in this situation. And it's not really the right question to ask, but how do we use this moment, right, to move forward? And so, this event, when it happened, I would always look at the comments, you get obsessed about it. And so there was this question whether we're documented or undocumented. And so a few years ago, I had a PhD student who was an activist, and she was testified in Congress for DACA. She was one of the most prominent undocumented migrant students in this country. And she died in a car accident, and she was killed by a drunk driver. And then on her death, she was killed by a drunk driver in Maine. the news and the way she was, the comments on, the announcement of her death was basically like, oh, they deserve to die because they shouldn't have been in this country because they were like undocumented, students. I mean, the way they were so dehumanized for being undocumented was just so upsetting that I had to stop reading it. So then I was like looking for that same kind of reaction to this. And I was actually struck that there wasn't. And I was like, well, what does this mean, right? Like, how do we use this as a moment, like to talk about like the value of all the types of, service work, that we as immigrants provide in this country, right? And I was very relieved that like anti-undocumented, sort of like they're criminals, they don't deserve to be here, was not in the narrative. And so I want to pause and say, what does that mean for us, right? Like, how do we use this as a moment to move forward with that? And then a second, thing that I wanted to talk about is like, how do you use this as a moment to build interracial coalitions with other marginalized groups? And there was like op-eds being written, about like, Black, activists saying they wanted to be allies, but there was one, I can't remember who wrote it, that really struck me because it was like, let's use this as a moment to be allies, but don't forget that Asians are like so anti-Blacks. Like, don't forget that they're like, they victimize us when we patronize their stores. So then there's that narrative. So how do we use this, as a conversation to basically use like, sorry to be so academic, but, you use this moment as one of shared, of strategic essentialism, right? Like this, like shared experience of hegemonic violence, right? To come across your differences. And I think that's something we haven't really talked about, as, how do we then use this as a moment to have coalitions with, other, racial ethnic groups that have been known or documented to face kind of much more intense physical violence by the state than we have as Asian Americans, right? And I think that's an important conversation, that we should have.
So we're at time. So I want to be cognizant of time and just to say thank you to everyone who was who participated today, to the folks in the audience for the questions. There were about 4 questions asking, sort of how can folks be allies? What do we do here? I hope that, I'm sure each of you have very nuanced answers to those questions, but I do want to recognize that we're at time. And if I ask the question and have 5 of you respond, I think we're going to really be over time. So I don't want to ignore those questions, but I just want to leave it there and maybe have it be something you can reflect on. And those that were in the audience, you can look all of these great panelists up online, and you can ask them those questions that are probably more specific and unique to the particular organizations or academic institutions that they're affiliated with. And so I just want to end there and say thank you so much. Special thanks to Riley as well for moving so quickly with me on this. And yeah, good night, everyone. Thank you.